Good morning. This will be 8 characteristics of living things. 7 living things maintain an stable internal environment, also called homeostasis, that is, keeping what's inside of you the same. We're going to be talking about the story of Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and their experiences as King Nebuchadnezzar tries to light them on fire. But before that, our example from creation of a stable internal environment is that for your cells, the cells of a living thing, to operate optimally, they need a specific preset temperature. We have warm-blooded and cold-blooded things inside of our world. You and I are warm-blooded mammals. I was watching a documentary on Antarctica, which is one of the most interesting places in the world, and I hope that God blesses me with an opportunity to be there at some point. What is, among other things, so interesting is that, so it's essentially a desert because of the lack of rainfall, even though there is a huge amount of frozen water there. So it's a cold, frozen desert. On the land, the largest native animal, purely land animal, is a very tiny species of fly. But there is abundant aquatic life around the continent and under the ice. The majority of the fish share a very unusual characteristic. You see, the water is several degrees below what is normal Earth freezing temperature, and which should mean all the fish are frozen solid, which should mean that there are no fish. But for many years, they studied the fish that lived in the water. The expectation being that, well, most fish throughout the world, if you touch them with something frozen, the rest of the body freezes instantly. This is how I remembered from the documentary. What they discovered is inside of the fish's body is a protein that acts as an antifreeze, meaning that it can resist freezing for just a few degrees lower than normal freezing, and thus continue to live in a temperature that should kill it. Now, I think we will notice that's a very interesting parallel as we get into the story of Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in Daniel 3. I'm going to abbreviate for the sake of brevity. The people of God have been taken into captivity by the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar. And he wanted a single kingdom that worshipped one God. He was a worshiper of Marduk. And he made a statue that was 90 feet tall and 9 feet across, which, if your buildings aren't tall, is a very easy to see thing. When I stand in the parking lot of the church I attend, I can see a building in downtown Concord that is 13 stories tall. One of the taller buildings in Concord. I don't know if it is the tallest, but it is a very tall building for Concord standards. In that fashion, it could have been that people could see that from a long way off. He decreed that there was a song that would be played, and he listed a set of instruments that play this song, and at that point all members of this kingdom would have to throw themselves on the ground and worship. Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego began to worship God, our God, the true God, the God of the Bible, in secret. But someone told, these guys don't fall down when they hear the song. And they were brought before Nebuchadnezzar, and they admitted to what they had done. And he became immensely angry and told them The usual punishment for failing to worship this idol, a representation of me, is to be thrown alive into a furnace. But you are special. You have so openly flouted my God King authority and worthiness of worship that you leave me no choice. I want this lit to a temperature 7 times its usual temperature. Now, being of a somewhat scientific temperament, I thought I would try to figure out what those numbers meant. Now, one possibility is he's being hyperbolic, he's exaggerating. He might just mean a lot hotter. Temperatures on the Earth do not get as hot, say, as the temperatures out in space. The temperature on the sun, temperature of the core of the Earth tends to be the hottest thing going around here, and then that is not as hot as the surface of the sun or certain other things that occur in space. But if one was to try and determine what those number relationships are, we see first of all our natural body temperature is 98.6 degrees. That is your human operating temperature. We know that if we endure a temperature due to a fever, fighting an infection, much higher, 104, 105, you can damage your brain. So that will be important as we examine the story as it goes on. We as humans exist in a very narrow window of what it means to be healthy. That is, when you have a fever or chills and you feel the cold thing, the human body is suffering a great deal, is by a few degrees of temperature in the big picture, much higher and much lower. Nebuchadnezzar wanted to make an example of people that not worshipped him, and when draconian rulers do this, they're hoping that those that have considered rebellion will look at this and say, oh, this is bad, I don't want to do this, much as a public execution is intended to do. This is a public execution, but one of a very dramatic fashion. The temperature at which human flesh is destroyed is 162 degrees, which will leave bones. So, we will see if the temperature being applied to them would have affected their bodies. What would have been remaining for this example, where Nebuchadnezzar could say, see, look what happened to those rebels. We know what happens to rebels around here. So I did find one set of temperature differences where a attainable normal fire temperature could be magnified by 7 times. So the initial starting point of a wood fire is 300 degrees. At 300 degrees, the fire in your fireplace, the fire in your bonfire begins. Those things get much hotter, but here is a starting point, okay? And so, it's way greater than the 98.6, and way greater than what it takes to ignite human flesh, to destroy human flesh. Ignite's the wrong term. Technically speaking, everything has a burning point. Most of the time, we live in such a comfortable temperature that we don't experience anything like that. Human bone burns at 1800 degrees. When we experience cremation, we practice cremation sometimes in our society. We have special ovens for the purpose of turning human flesh into ash or dust, flesh and bone into ash or dust, so that they can be remembered in some fashion. Both of my maternal grandparents were cremated with the intention of ashes being distributed places that they enjoyed. I visit my grandmother's ashes. I don't believe you can talk to the dead, but there is something calming and peaceful as a place to talk to God about the place where my grandmother's ashes, the columbarium, where ashes are interred. Now, the final number is 2010. When we burn charcoal. Charcoal is actually a very pivotal human invention that the ability of human beings to forge steel had to do with the temperatures which were achievable via charcoal, which is something humans did not figure out for a long time. We found metal, we hit metal with sticks, we shaped it into things, but the ability to forge metal came with the understanding of charcoal, which burned things at higher temperatures and enabled people to change the chemical properties of metal. Nonetheless, that number 2,100 would have been enough to do terrifying things. The initial fire that he might have been using in his furnace, I mean, he doesn't give us temperatures, would have been enough to decimate flesh and give you scary bones to look at. You know, you could have said to all the people, see, look at that pile of bones. That's the last person who tried to defy me. But with this sevenfold increase, which may in fact have been the difference between wood and charcoal, you could have said, look, there's nothing left. They have been completely consumed. They're a pile of dust, just like someone who's been cremated. And you could have terrified those that defied you. They throw these 4 men in, and that's the expectation. The flesh will immediately be destroyed, and in a short time later, the bones will be dust. They look through the opening, and they see 3 strange characteristics. 1, we sent in these men. There is another man. Nobody's on fire, and the new man looks like the Son of God, whatever that means. Now, were they even in temperatures approaching that which would destroy human flesh, they would be as badly off as someone with bad fevers. You've experienced being 104, 105, 106 degrees, and you're mental. You are unstable physically. You can't balance well, but they're walking, which I think is why the Holy Spirit allows the word walking to come through in his expression, is that, well, clearly they've got the balance. How do they have the balance? Because these men chose to maintain the internal stability of who they worship, God chose to give them a physical stability of their internal temperature. They could focus on their internal spiritual homeostasis by saying, no matter whether I'm in captivity or not, whether or not martial law has been placed on my worship habits, I'm going to stay on the inside someone who worships God. And God responds with, yes, I'll be with you, and I'll maintain your spiritual and physical temperature. In Jesus' name.